Sometimes in life, there's a bit of a difference between expectations and reality. A project at work, or a holiday, or an evening out which is supposed to go one way, but then it all goes wrong. Well, in one sense, that's not too dissimilar to what happened with the people of Israel. God is sovereign over all things, and nothing takes him by surprise. But Israel was struggling to live out the purpose God had ordained for it, to be a blessing to all the nations. We've seen so far that God created a good world, full of life and beauty and harmony. But when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, creation fell, and their relationship with God was severed. They were driven out of Eden. But God didn't give up on mankind. He established a covenant, a binding promise with Abraham and his family. He would make them into a nation. He would give them a land. He would bless them, and all the nations would be blessed through them. And God fulfills his promises to Abraham. In fact, he reaffirms his covenant and builds on it in the story of the Exodus. God's people, the Israelites, have by this time gone into Egypt to escape a famine, and they're now enslaved. But we read in Exodus 2, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And when God reveals himself to Moses at the burning bush, he reveals himself as the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And after he rescues his people, God doesn't just remember his covenant, he reaffirms it. God says to the Israelites in Exodus 19, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So although God is the God of the whole earth, this nation, Israel, will be his treasured possession. "I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God," he says elsewhere. They are to be a kingdom of priests, the middlemen between God and the rest of the world, making God known to the nations. And they are to be holy, to be distinct, to live differently in both their political and their spiritual lives. And so God gives Israel his law, giving them his good instructions about how they should live. God's law reflects God's heart, the heart of a God who is mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. That's what we read about him in Deuteronomy. And we see in the Psalms that for the Israelites, the law was not actually a burden at first. It was a delight. "Oh, how I love your law," they would sing. And by keeping the law, the Israelites were to be a light to the nations. "Observe it carefully," Moses said, "for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.'" And God also gives Israel his presence. He would dwell among the Israelites through the tabernacle, in the most holy place, in the tent where the Ark of the Covenant resided. He would dwell with his people as their God. And so God leads his people to the promised land. He wins the battle for them as they conquer Canaan in the book of Joshua. But throughout all of it, Israel struggles to live up to the covenant. Do you remember what God said? "If you obey me fully and keep my covenant." But in Exodus, already we read the story of the golden calf as Aaron leads the Israelites in bowing down before an idol. Or once they've entered the promised land, in Judges, God's people turn away from him and towards other gods, the gods of the Canaanites. Far from keeping God's good law, we read that in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Eventually, the people do ask for a king, but they don't do so for the right reasons. They approach their final judge, Samuel, and say, "Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But Israel isn't supposed to be like the other nations. Quite the opposite. Ultimately, they have rejected God as their king. God grants them their wish. But human kings are far from perfect, because human kings are flawed and fallen, just like all of us. Their first king, Saul, after initial success, fails to follow God's instructions and becomes paranoid and foolish, eventually taking his own life. In his place, God raises up David, a man after God's own heart. And David accomplishes some mighty things. He captures Jerusalem and makes it his capital. He drives away Israel's enemies, the Philistines. And God establishes a further covenant with David. David's son will build God's temple, his dwelling place. David's house will be established forever. If his descendants do wrong, then they will be punished, but they will always rule on Israel's throne. It provokes great rejoicing. We read about it in some of David's Psalms. Things seem to be going well. But Israel cannot escape from the problem of human sin. Even the best kings are flawed. David himself takes Bathsheba in adultery and kills her husband. Eventually, it leads to civil war. His son Solomon seems to do well and is renowned for his wealth and his wisdom, but he takes foreign women for himself and begins to follow foreign gods. Israel is becoming more like the nations again, after all. And under his son Rehoboam, the united monarchy over the 12 tribes of Israel fractures into two kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And human sin leads to one disaster after another as God's people turn away from him and away from his law. Far from being a light to the Gentiles, they begin to look just like them. But even if the Israelites have forgotten God, God has not forgotten them or his promises to them. God promises that there will be a son of David one day who will reign on David's throne forever and ever. There will be a king to come who will rule with justice and righteousness. A child will be born, a son will be given, a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, an everlasting Father, a Prince of Peace. And of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end, Isaiah prophesies. Even when humans fall short of what they could and should have been through their sin, God will still find a way to accomplish his plans and his purposes and his promises. God has not forgotten his promises. A king is coming one day, and when he does, he will turn this story around.